Ohio for inviting me to talk today about Ohio Modern. So I want to read through the learning objectives. Participants will learn to identify important mid-century architectural trends, designs, and the work of specific architects and firms practicing in Ohio. Participants will learn about characteristics defining mid-century residential developments and house types. Participants will learn to evaluate architectural design within the broad historic context and events of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Finally, participants will examine specific historic properties to identify their materials, design features, and characteristics. Why do I want to say, and somebody saying otherwise is itching for a fight. Michael Feldman. Okay, I put together this slide just because I think it really helps to show the contrast between late 19th, early 20th century architecture and what we're going to talk about today, modern architecture. And it sort of begs the question, what is modern? The buildings on the left were modern when they were built, but what we're going to talk about today is the time period mid-century and mid-century modernism, roughly the 1940s through the 70s. And what we'll see is that what dramatically differs is that what we're looking at is really no longer based on historic precedent. It's not borrowing from the past, the historic look to past sources. Just some of the design elements and aspects we're going to, for example, for today, we'll visit all of these in some aspect. At the beginning of World War II, Ohio ranked 4th in the nation in industrial production. It was a major supplier of iron, steel, heavy machinery, auto components, and tires. Ohio played a key role in the manufacturing of wartime goods, especially aircraft, automotive products, ordnance, and ships. With its immense industrial capacity, Ohio secured more than $15 billion in government contracts for war goods, with the largest share going to Cleveland, followed by Cincinnati, Akron, Dayton, Youngstown, Toledo, and Columbus. Wartime rationing caused people to do without many consumer goods, from refrigerators to automobiles, and as production lines were converted to meet the needs of war. Coming out of the war, though, Ohio's factories were ready to shift back to producing consumer needs, and depression and war-starved consumers were ready to buy. So products of wartime production that then transferred to building materials, and we're going to be seeing some examples of some of these today, is of course plywood, plexiglass, styrofoam, and also, I'm not going to go into great detail about this today, but the Lustron Corp. In 1948, it began producing prefabricated porcelain steel houses in a surplus aircraft factory right here in Columbus. It received government loan, was addressing the housing shortage. It was using some of these now available materials. There were 2,500 Lustron houses constructed before the company went out of business in 1950. We're going to focus a lot today on architectural design and the characteristics that help us understand and define modernism. Throughout 20th century American architecture shows a balance between traditional, conservative approaches and theories versus modern and at times even pioneering architectural statements and theories. The contrast is seen in the development of 20th century modern architecture. And when we talk about modernism in that term, we're really talking about a very broad term that encompasses many approaches to design, and we're certainly going to see that illustrated today. But let's break down modernism. Early 20th century styles and architecture, which we saw on the previous slide, were replaced with an architecture that was based upon function, modern technology, engineering, abstract designs, 20th century machine age aesthetics. There was an emphasis on creating architectural expressions to respond to machine age dominated society and culture. The machine was seen as an innovation. It was progress. Design emphasis on modern forms, streamlined, stripped down classicism. Architects struggled with how do you express the machine age through modern architectural design. So these very earliest examples are what we would call early conservative modernism. They're new styles and materials that were accepted, but recognizable images, scales, proportions, and ornament were not completely abandoned. They still borrowed to some extent from the past in a classical way, but not in an archaeological way. They weren't literally imitating earlier buildings or styles. And a great example of that are the two buildings we have on the screen here. The originally known as the Ohio Departments of State on the left, designed by Cincinnati architect Harry Hake. And when we look at this building, we see more or less traditional architecture. It's axial plan. You see here in the bottom the main grand concourse circulation pattern. The ornament, the overall form, its setbacks, flattened geometric ornament, the murals inside the building, and sculpture that are all celebrating the history and peoples of Ohio. These are all classical forms, recognizable forms, but they're presented in a very modern, stripped down, stylized way with emphasis on that geometric forms. And actually, the structure and the form and the functional realities of the buildings are explained. Whoops. We see here in the building, the public meeting rooms project out towards the river. The tall shaft of the building, once state offices, now offices associated with the Supreme Court. And the top was the state library originally, now the law library for the Supreme Court. So again, these new styles, new materials, but recognizable images, scales, proportion, and ornament. Stripped down classicism, still relying on very traditional interpretations of symmetry, proportion, balance, and a hierarchy of space. Meanwhile, on the right, the Greyhound bus station in Cleveland, Ohio, here's a new building type, bus station terminal, and also the building being designed and seen as advertisement, the realization that industry and advertisement were sources of visual arts. And here's this art moderne, more rounded, curved corners, certainly an emphasis on movement. You might think you were going to walk into that building and actually be like boarding a bus and take the building to your destination. But again, these expressions of modernism that again rely on traditional forms and so stripped down classicism, architects practicing with this type of design ideas were called half moderns. So what comes next? The much more radical modernism, where it's completely breaking from the past. Designs are dominated by European design theories, and the old order of historicism is completely replaced by a new architecture, again, based on function, modern technology, abstract design. It's not a single style or design approach, and I think we'll see that as we finish up, as we go through today's webinar, but it represents various individual expressions. And truly, it was a new architecture that was designed and created for the 20th century. One of the first design ideas, stylistic trends we're going to talk about is the international style. It really is the beginning of what's known as this radical modernism. It is ahistoric, it is very abstract, machine produced. In 1932, the Museum of Modern Art mounted an exhibition, the International Exhibition of Modern Architecture. Its curators were Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson. And in it, the buildings that were on display, which included the two buildings in the right-hand corner, S Building and the Lovell House by Richard Neutra, these helped to define the and national style. And we see by looking at the PSF building, it is asymmetrical. It is not that tripart design. It has cantilevered parts. It has no applied ornamentation. It was considered the first modern United States skyscraper. And as I said, its elevations are asymmetrical, separated out to reflect the different functions within the building. Not unlike the Supreme Court building in Columbus, but again now in a very modern way. It's featuring mostly on the details and the nature of the materials that are being used in those spaces. Likewise, the Lovell House, designed by Neutra, it's this white kind of object in the landscape, had applied concrete as its surface material, and we see these volumetric setbacks. So right here in Ohio, we have the Terrace Plaza, innovative modernist mixed-use development. It was Cincinnati's first major downtown construction project following World War II. And it's a really considered nationally recognized example of the international style. It was one of the first modernist hotels in the United States, and very importantly, it was the first major building by Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, who we'll see went on to become quite a major architectural force in the United States in the design of modernism. And it received widespread attention and acclaim. It was developed by the Emrys of Cincinnati, John Emry Jr. specifically, and it really combined, it was a synthesis of modern art and architecture. The entire building, interior hotel, which is the recessed portion with the windows that is up on top of the building, seen here. This lower portion were two department stores, the Bonds department store and the, I really can't hover over there, it moves, and the adjacent Penny department store, and then street front level storefronts. But everything, it was a complete design. The furnishings, staff uniforms, table settings, even down to the matchbooks were designed specifically for this building and this space and for the hotel. Another interesting aspect was that Gordon Bunshaft, who was serving in World War II, this building was started at the while the war was still going on, resulted in the design being primarily by Natalie DeBlois. So a very successful, large-scale building designed by a woman architect working at SOM. The one postcard shows us the gourmet restaurant. The mural was by Joan Miro. There was also a Saul Steinberg mural by a new artist, and so an Alexander Calder mobile. When the building sold in 1956, eventually by 1965, much of that artwork had been relocated to the Cincinnati Art Museum. The Rowell House up in the right-hand corner is another Cincinnati example of this international style. Again, we see that characteristics of flat roof, asymmetrical elevations, brick walls in this case with white stucco, the corner windows, just overall that asymmetric emphasis on the volume, smooth surfaces. This was designed by Cincinnati architect John Becker and for Frederick Rao, salesman, insurance executive. So now let's look at work that defines, again, mostly corporate architecture in this time period, but is associated with a couple key designers and individuals. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, He comes to the United States in 1937. He's 50 years old. He becomes the director of architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. We see the beginnings of modern architecture really date back to the 1930s and even the 1920s. But the Depression, World War II sort of stops all construction and therefore halts modernism in its progression. And it really does not pick back up with vigor until after the war, 1945 and on. Mies van der Rohe and some of his contemporaries practiced in a leading school in Germany. The Bauhaus was considered the premier school of architecture at that time, similar to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. However, the Nazis closed it down. They considered modernism decadent. So many European modernists immigrate to the United States in the mid to late 30s. And they find themselves in architecture schools in the United States. So they pick up this idea and the concepts and their just learning practices of teaching architecture of the Bauhaus and apply them into the programs that they find themselves in. Walter Gropius is at Harvard. Saarinen is in Cranbrook in Michigan. Alvo Aalto is at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And then likewise, when returning veterans come back and take advantage of the GI Bill, many of them enroll in architecture school. So a couple examples that set the tone for what we see here in Ohio is, of course, Lever House. This is by Skidmore, Owen, and Merrill, specifically Gordon Bunshaft. He's back from the war. And it's really one of their earliest and most successful elaborations on the glass curtain wall, and defines for us this glass box as corporate headquarters. Likewise, the Seagram's building, designed by Mies, becomes the symbol of American business. It is monumental, abstract beauty. This glass box, again, goes hand in hand with corporate headquarters. And likewise in Ohio, the Libby Owens Ford building, of course, celebrating the headquarters of a major manufacturer in the glass industry in Toledo, total glass curtain wall box. And its interior details and decor were also manufactured out of glass products, mosaics, fiberglass products, and artwork that incorporated the use of glass. So obviously celebrating that idea. And again, an early introduction of modernism into these urban centers. Likewise, 55 Public Square in Cleveland, the illuminating building, the headquarters for the electric company. It is the first building built on Public Square in 1958 since Terminal Tower was built in the 1920s. And even in that upper shot, you see the outline of Terminal Tower reflected in the building, and you certainly see that contrast between that Beaux-Arts classicism defined by Terminal Tower and now this modernism expressed in the 55 Public Square. So let's break these buildings down. Essentially, they are floating concrete slabs supported by plain steel columns. They are floating boxes. The curtain wall, which is central to the development of modern architecture, makes this possible. It provides these new opportunities for architectural expression. By definition, a curtain wall is an enclosing wall built and supported between columns or piers and/or girders or other support. It sustains no weight other than its own. It's not load-bearing. That's steel or usually steel construction, steel frame construction. It is weather-tight and it's fireproof. So what we have, and I think it's illustrated here in all of these buildings, is really a classical composition, and it became a major type associated with the modernist skyscraper. These rectangular forms, they're a module pattern expressed by structural frame and the curtain wall. They have very subtle details. The grid of the frame is frankly expressed. Inside, you may see floating stairs or simple curved walls, or on the exterior, just the simple line and definition and profile of a projecting I-beam becomes the subtle decoration. And in many modernist architecture, you really have to experience the space that's created inside the building to be able to grasp all the architectural aspects, the spatial relationship, the openness of the plan, and any other details. Even, and more so than in 19th century architecture, where there might be a quite lively exterior to look at as well. These are more about creating space and defining space within their confines. So turning on to residential, Frank Lloyd Wright's contribution to modernism is clearly understood. It really is an evolution of his career. Of course, starting with his 20th century prairie-style houses, which Westcott House in Springfield is Ohio's example. We begin to see that idea of the open plan, linear, horizontal emphasis, use of natural materials. In the 1930s, Wright designs Falling Water, which really links him to this broader international style. He probably wouldn't say so, but architectural historians can lump him in that. But it definitely defines that abstract nature, the geometric emphasis, and the volume of the interior spaces are articulated through those projecting cantilevered concrete slabs, and then the use of the natural stone, relating it back, tying it back into its setting. And then on to his Usonian houses. These really reflect the second phase of Frank Lloyd Wright's career. They are standardized, we see them here, up here at the top and at the bottom. They are standardized, prefabricated house plans, and they very much are leading and influence the development of the more typical commonplace ranch house type, and very much help to define post-World War II housing. Usonian was developed before the war, but then it became a very conceptual model for much of the residential building after the war. The Weltzheimer Johnson House in Oberlin is the first Usonian design building by Wright in Ohio. We would end up having 9 Usonian designed houses by Wright in Ohio, scattered throughout the state. Several in Cincinnati, several in Canton, and in northeast Ohio. And then, of course, the Penfield House, which was actually built by its owner, but it was built from Frank Lloyd Wright specifically designed plans. So here we see an expression in Rush Creek of those Usonian principles. Rush Creek and the buildings at Rush Creek neighborhood in Worthington were not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. They were designed by Ted Van Fossen. They were built by the husband and wife building team of Martha and Richard Wakefield. Both of the Wakefields and Van Fossen had visited Taliesin. They knew of Wright's writings. They knew of Wright's work, and were very much taken into that larger concept and that definition of Usonian architecture and creating this organic neighborhood, which developed between 1954 and 1976 in its initial building out. It's a distinctive, houses are distinctive, one-of-the-kind designs. They relate to nature and each other. And very much are inspired by Usonian design concepts. The buildings take advantage of the natural terrain and ravine and the creeks that run through this portion and run through this neighborhood, and they're definitely not set up on any type of a grid pattern, but they are oriented to take advantage of natural sunlight and, as I said, to relate to one another in their setting and their relationship to one another. So let's specifically talk a little bit more about Usonian architecture and its components. As I said before, it's a standardized house form, and it's usually created, the plan is based on a standardized unit of measurement that then is used throughout the design. It helps define the size and space and correlation of spaces. It's made of inexpensive materials, usually concrete blocks, plywood, other brick, other inexpensive materials. It has an open plan, which again goes back to those prairie style architectural designs of Wright's, but often there's a core fireplace and core space in which the plan is centered off of and spins off of, with long open living spaces and fairly compact private spaces and utilitarian spaces such as the kitchen and baths. They were roughly built between the 1930s and the 50s, and also unnecessary elements were eliminated through technological innovations. They typically usually had no basements. They were slab construction. They often utilized carports instead of garages, radiant heat, and typical no plaster. They were concrete surface finishes on the interior. But the Rush Creek was built because of the tremendous demand, and next several slides we're going to talk about examples of that, the tremendous demand placed on housing. There was a real housing shortage, again, coming off of the Depression, coming off of the war years when construction materials were diverted to war production, and then the returning veterans. They left, growing up in their parents' house, they came back to start families and have houses and live on their own. And so we see this time period really defined by innovation and efforts to address this housing shortage. And interestingly enough, the Rush Creek homeowners had difficulty obtaining bank loans. These houses were too weird. They were too modern. And even they couldn't get housing or loans from the Federal Housing Administration, would not finance them because of the modernist approach and appearance of them. And we will see that actually, again, as I mentioned, the impact of returning veterans and the execution of federal programs, particularly the GI Bill or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, and the work of the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration developed standards for housing, and it developed suburban residential developments. Government insured home loans, but it government insured home loans to very specific type of properties. Its preferred choice of style were Cape Cod houses. They considered them to be the best shelter for the least price and the most economical and efficient house that you could build. It had, as I said, the FHA had a very conservative view of housing. And we also see some of the examples of their layouts for subdivisions, typically defined by curvilinear streets, pretty standard size lot sizes, cul-de-sacs, and one or two means of entering and exiting the subdivision onto adjacent ulterior main roadway. So these were pretty formulaic, but they certainly were aspects that were encouraged and for the development and layout of subdivisions. And with this influx of returning veterans and families and this tremendous housing shortage that had been brought on by lack of construction, wartime shortages, and military priority usage of construction materials, as I said, post-World War II can be defined by the subdivision. the new neighborhoods that were springing up throughout the countryside and outwardly from the center of formerly urban centers. And interestingly enough, you often will also go to older neighborhoods in urban centers that were maybe built out or built up in the late 19th, early 20th century, and see a scattering of newer houses too from this time period, which either shows that in some cases some of the lots that weren't built out were quickly bought up, purchased, and built out, or larger lots in some cases were subdivided and then built out. So we have, suburbs that are defined by building suburbs, build your own housing, speculative housing, and where do houses come from, Mommy? Mostly, they come from plan books, which we're going to talk about a lot more here in a little bit later on. Plan books such as this 1946 design, House of the Month, small book of small houses, that might have been offered through banks or other lending institutions, or even through residential builders to help you pick out your house. And you can see that the Cape Cod had a lot of different varieties of flexibility and variety to its floor plans, but not everyone benefited equally from all of these federal, particularly the federal programs. The Federal Housing Administration guidelines advocated for protective covenants to be put on housing, and also, as we said, they discriminated against other than very traditional housing stocks such as Cape Cods, and they also discriminated against based on race and other factors. The Carver edition, the George Washington Carver edition here in Columbus, part of the historic African-American neighborhood of Hanford Village, is a Federal Housing Administration suburb composed of Cape Cod houses built for African-American veterans, roughly between 1946 and 1947. And it is one of the first of this example in the country where FHA was providing financing and housing opportunities for African Americans. The Washington Carver edition illustrates the limits and struggle that African Americans engaged in related to their rights as citizens in a segregated environment. The subdivision is notable for being the home of a number of Tuskegee Airmen while they were based at the Lockbourne Army Air Force Base southeast of Columbus, again during that same time period, 1946, 1949. Many of the families that originally built these or purchased these houses still lived in them, or members of their family still live in them. So the subdivision represents a northern pre-classic civil rights era, post-World War II FHA associated suburb, and that was constructed for and marketed to African American veterans. And you'll notice it's primarily made up of these two housing types. Either a side gable with the center front door, or a front door off to the side, or the front gable with, again, a center doorway or doorway off to the side. The beauty of the Cape Cod was it was a very efficient floor plan, but it also 2.5 stories. Often the upper story could be built out at a later time for a teenager or relative. And so it did lend a lot of flexibility in a relatively small amount of square footage. And the Hanford Village was, again, roughly built between late 1940s and it is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It was listed at the national level of significance because of its innovation and breaking down some of those barriers that were associated with the FHA government-sponsored housing programs. And its period of significance in National Register lingo ends in 1963, which we can see here in these two maps. On the left is the image of the original plan of the George Washington Carver edition. You see it is picture book of those FHA subdivision practices. It has the cul-de-sac, it has the curvilinear streets, it has the uniform lot sizes, and the limited access to the adjacent main transportation routes. And then we see over here, this was actually the district map for the National Register nomination. In 1963, when the interstate highway, federal interstate highway, was being built through Columbus, you can see that the route was taken to cut right through and bifurcate the Hanford Village, and severed off a main portion of it and the park that was associated with the subdivision. So kind of once again, government programming significantly impacting this neighborhood. And when you get off at 70, if you're heading towards Main Street and Bexley, now you know what those four little Cape Cod houses are. It's the other portion of Hanford Village. So moving on to the ranch house, developing in the 1930s, California architects Cliff May, William Worcester were influenced by southwestern ranches, haciendas, derived from the adobe dwellings of Spanish colonial tradition, and likewise Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie houses and his Usonian experiments. They're intrigued by the open plans, the horizontal emphasis, the large windows, corner windows, natural wood, masonry. We see here some of their examples were published in the Sunset magazine, Western Ranch Houses. Then also in the 30s, the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, and actually all of the World's Fairs that were sponsored during the 30s, including the Great Lakes Exposition in Cleveland. These all featured display houses of modern designs. Actually, these World's Fairs were really meant to make sure consumers didn't forget how to be consumers, and once the war ended, they were going to be ripe to want all these modern conveniences and modern housing that were being displayed during these world fairs. But one of the most important houses, of course, was the House of Tomorrow by George Fred Keck. And architectural publication, professional journals, Architectural Record, Progressive Architecture, the Case Study Series in Art and Architecture showcase the work of the new generation of modernist architects, such as Ray and Charles Eames. You see examples above of their work. These were modern designs, though, modern houses. They utilized cantilevered forms, jettisoning over hillsides in the California landscape, glass curtain walls, steel post and beam construction. More popular examples of ranch houses were published in plan books, popular magazines such as Better Homes and Gardens, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, newspapers, and books were published, such as titles like Tomorrow's House, How to Plan Your Post-War Home, published in 1945, or 1946 publication, If You Want to Build a House. So the reality of the ranch is a much more mainstream popular version of post-war housing. The ranch house type, which defines, along with the Cape Cod and split level, the suburban development of post-war America and certainly Ohio. Really, it was no larger than the average house of the early 1900s. It just was all on one floor. And there was this one level of spaciousness, and it suggested easy living. And it was very much related to the outdoors and particularly the backyard. The emphasis of the living space shifted somewhat to away from front porches, living rooms off the front in the front of the house, to open plans, living room, dining room combinations, but most often delegated to more to the rear of the house to then work off of the terrace and patio and backyard, and that emphasis with the kitchen maybe more towards the front of the house. Also, during the 50s, 60s, the dominant housekeeper was the wife, the woman, and her domain was the kitchen. So from the kitchen window, she could sort of see what was going on in the neighborhood. And also in these one-story living spaces, if you look at the floor plan on the screen, you see the distinction between public and private space. Public space flows through the entrance back to the living room, dining room, out to the terrace, around to the kitchen, whereas then one hallway takes you to the bedrooms and more private spaces. And of course, nod to those big curtain wall expanses is the picture window, large scale window, and also the garages, which were most often attached, sometimes prominently located in the front of the house, but sometimes kind of concealed and with windows that made it look just like a portion of the living quarters, and the door opening tucked around to the side of the house. Between 1950 and 1960, Ohio's population increased by 22%, and more than 1.8 million houses were built throughout the state. Post-war Ohio was a hive of construction activity. Home ownership increased by 50% between 1945 and 1960. And population was moving within the state, and guess where they were moving? They were going out to the suburbs. So along with them, and not only their houses, came some other property types I just want to wrap up with focusing on that are dominant types associated with this time period. Banks, for starters. Down in the bottom, you see the manufacturer's Hanover Trust Bank, New York City, designed by our friends at Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, SOM. This was considered the first modern bank branch, first modern bank. And what is it? It's a glass box with grid of aluminum mullions, very open plan, 4 stories. Lower 2 were the banking floors, the upper 2 were office space. You can very visually see the vault and the circular escalator, the circulation patterns, all visible from the street. Transparency, and why not? Modern banks wanted to be able to convey their new services, their new technology. They wanted to be likened with efficiency, economy, less stuffy. And they also were creating new types of buildings, the drive-through technology, bank branches out in those suburbs, more automation, and also who again was responsible and got a lot of the blame for the Depression, the banks. Banks had to create a new image. They wanted to shed their pre-war Depression era image, kind of reestablish the confidence of the public, rebuild public esteem and faith in the banking institutions. So also coming with the end of the war was fiscal and housing boom, resulting in unprecedented growth in the banking industry. So at this time period, we see banks taking on and really adapting this new modern building types. and we just have two examples from the Columbus area. And I think modern banking facilities, these are some of the types of buildings. This is how modernism is going to be expressed in many small communities throughout our state. And they're going to be examples of this modernist design, often incorporate high quality materials, innovative designs. Also religious properties. Again, these are going to be some of the most modern examples of modern expressions in your communities. The details, the quality of materials, the interior details and spaces, these distinctive bell towers, which often are separate towers that define the religious properties built in the post-war era. And modern religious design is influenced in particularly by churches in Columbus, Indiana. Cummins was a motor manufacturer in Columbus, Indiana, and he brought nationally recognized modern architects to design 70 major buildings in Columbus, Indiana, just about 3 hours drive from here near Indianapolis, making Columbus become a mecca for this concentration of modern architecture. And we consider one of, again, the prototypes of religious architecture in the of Saranen's Church in Columbus, Indiana, 1942. And again, it starts defining how we see religious architecture with those, particularly those distinctive, separated out bell towers. St. Stephen's Episcopal Church and University Center, 1951, Brooks and Coddington. It was considered really one of the first modern churches, expressions of churches in Ohio. If you see in the interior, it has this very unstructured nave, and it features this cathedral ceiling supported by a series of laminated trusses. It's very open. It's openness in not just the nave and the worship space, but it opens up with this wall of windows to the adjacent courtyard, and then the adjacent university center, community center space. It was the first design to win the Ohio AIA's, American Institute of Architects, 25-year awards. When they started this program, St. Stephen's was the first recipient of this award. Park Synagogue in Cleveland Heights is actually the last work of Mendelssohn, this major modernist architect, and it is considered a landmark in ecclesiastical architecture in the United States. It's building as symbol. It's a dramatic features of architecture, expresses the function, social, spiritual meaning expressed through the use of new modern materials. It's reinforced concrete. Its dome was intended to symbolically express God's universe and his relationship to man. This 120-foot diameter copper dome appears to float above through the series of ribbon windows around this cylindrical drum. The drum and dome and cylinder form the sanctuary space and invokes this image of heaven and earth. Very dramatic space created by all use of clear glass. The interior dome is painted white, so it doesn't need any type of artificial lighting. It's naturally lit and also provides views of the sunset. Includes classrooms and office space also in the wing that projects out. So again, these religious properties are very important elements of modern design that are most frequently going to be seen expressed in, I think, communities across the state. Lastly, we'll wrap up with late 60s and 70s. We see, and particularly in Ohio, in the Governor Rhodes administration, there was a dramatic push for and need for new college campuses, development of community campuses. During the Rhodes administrations, we went from 6 state-funded colleges to 12. We doubled the amount of state-funded colleges throughout the state, and we saw the development of these community colleges, such as the Sinclair Community College in Dayton, designed by Edward Durrell Stone. And these are mostly urban college campuses. Again, developed and designed and placed within the urban environment. In this case, we have a fairly traditional looking college quad or campus setting, but again, all defining and relating to more abstract geometric spacing and relationships, a freestanding bell tower, clock tower, and these predominantly concrete structured buildings, leading to Durrell's interpretation of brutalism, and another example of this modern architectural trend, which really is designed, it's called brutalism. It's an expression of modernism where it's typically concrete construction conveying the nature of its construction through rough finished surfaces and bold geometric massing. And I think both the Sinclair College and the Ohio History Center help to illustrate that particular expression of modernism. In the mid-60s, again, the Governor Rhodes administration promoted a $290 million bond issue. $10 million of that was directed towards building the Ohio History Center, a new home for the Ohio Historical Society. $2 million else was directed to other history-related sites and properties throughout Ohio. And when the Ohio History Center was opened, Architectural Record called it a bold, imaginative, almost startling design. No doubt the most architecturally significant structure built in Ohio since the state capitol. And it is a monumental building. It was built right off of the newly constructed interstate highway passing through Columbus, sort of, I think, beckoning to what was then considered the new Main Street, the new means of transportation. And we see this daring design of the building articulated through this large, massive block that is cantilevered over the glass plaza level, and then with the museum level spreading out below it underground. And Byron Ireland was the architect. His overall design shows that he was trying to create a monumental building, and a building that spoke to and articulated the functions within. It clearly showed the upper portion being the reading room and the archives library, and then its dual purpose of the museum floor below that. Poured concrete, poured in place 21,000 cubic yards of concrete. And lastly, I want to wrap up with just talking and illustrating a little bit about some of the buildings we've talked about in more detail today are listed in the National Register, but here we have just a sampling of some of the properties that have recently been added to the National Register of Historic Places and help illustrate the tremendous wealth of modernism and the modernist statements that define Ohio architecture and history from this time period. We have a ranch house, not just one, we have a couple, but this is Irma Bombeck's house, is listed in the National Register recently, obviously for her association with humorist defining of suburban life out in the suburbs, which she wrote her syndicated articles and her books right from her ranch house in Centerville out in Montgomery County. Also, the fiberglass tower This is an example of urban renewal development in Toledo. And it is an example of IMPay urban planning design with the high-rise glass box fiberglass tower, the corporate headquarters for Owens Corning Fiberglass. And it's coupled then with the intact urban plan, urban park setting of what was called Levi Square in Toledo, which still retains some of the hardscape and the planting boxes and sidewalk patterns that are associated with this example of urban renewal downtown redevelopment. The high-rise was designed by Harrison and Abrabowitz, and as I said before, the whole plan was laid out by IMPay. Tower East at the bottom of the screen, built 1967 to 1968. Example of an office tower designed by Walter Gropius. It's one of the only examples of his work in Ohio, and also it relays and tells a fascinating, interesting story of zoning challenges in Shaker Heights, and again, just the story of this modernist building in an otherwise very traditional early 20th century community. And Westerly Apartments, 1962 to 1974, and they are thought to be the first example of a federally funded housing and urban design, HUD money, affordable elderly housing in the country. So I think these small examples show us that the National Register criteria and integrity have not changed, but are certainly applicable and can be applied to modern architecture and important modern events in Ohio, and the work of important architects. So that wraps us up, and or if there are any questions.
We have just a couple questions. Do you think ranch house neighborhoods will influence the National Register in the coming years?
Well, that's a great question, and I think what we need to continue to do is identify through survey or through other means of research within a community, what are the subdivisions, ranch subdivisions that represent significant broad trends, or are there, and communities will have them, are there subdivisions that show the work of particular developers and their impact on developing the suburbs? Or are there some that are early examples of this trend of suburbia that remain intact and show certain design qualities? So again, it's applying the National Register criteria and thinking about integrity, but then applying it to this time period. What are the important themes, important aspects of history that define a community and their post-war development? And then what are the resources that in turn convey that in the most significant way?
All right. Well, that is about it for our time. I would like to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. Our next webinar will be on July 8th with Sandra Hall, and we will be talking about utilizing liquor licenses in revitalization districts. For a calendar of upcoming events, including our future webinars, please visit us at adventureohio.org. So have a great day, everybody.